In the dimly lit corridors of Manhattan's most prestigious corporate tower, destiny was about to play its hand. Frank Martinez had spent 20 years keeping these marble floors spotless, invisible to the suits who walked them daily. That late October evening, while most had gone home, his mop bucket squeaked through the 44th floor when he heard it, desperate pounding from the executive elevator. Others might have called maintenance, might have waited for protocol. But Frank remembered his father's words, "Son, the right thing doesn't wait for permission." Prying those doors open with nothing but determination and a janitor's tools, he found himself face to face with Sarah Blackwood, though he didn't know then that she was the building's owner and CEO of Blackwood Enterprises. But what made this billionaire CEO, known for her ruthless business acumen, offer a simple janitor the opportunity of a lifetime? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Martinez's day always began at 4:30 a.m., when most of Manhattan was still dreaming. In the quiet darkness of his modest Bronx apartment, he would carefully iron his gray uniform, just as his father had taught him 30 years ago. The morning ritual hadn't changed since he was 16, watching Papa Martinez prepare for his own shift at the old General Hospital. The faded photograph on his dresser showed them both in matching uniforms. Frank's still crisp and new, his father's weathered by years of honest work. "Dignity isn't in what you do, Hijo," his father would say, straightening Frank's collar. "It's in how you do it." Those words had become the foundation of Frank's life, carrying him through 2 decades of service at the Blackwood Tower. His small, efficiency apartment told the story of a life lived simply, but with purpose. The walls were adorned with certificates from night classes he'd taken at the community college, business administration, building maintenance, even some computer basics. Not that anyone at work knew about them. Between the evening shifts and caring for his father during his final years, Frank never had the chance to pursue something more. But he never complained. Papa Martinez hadn't raised a son who measured success by the size of his office. The subway ride to Manhattan was his quiet time, watching the city wake up through scratched windows. He'd arrive at the tower by 6:15, walking through the employee entrance, where security guard Joe would greet him with the same nod he'd given for 15 years. The basement locker room was his first stop, where he'd methodically check his cleaning supplies, just as he did every morning. "Morning, Mr. Martinez," young Tommy, the new weekend janitor, would say whenever their shifts overlapped. Frank had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him the proper way to maintain the expensive marble floors, how to be thorough without being seen, and most importantly, how to treat every task with respect. "You've got magic in those hands, Mr. M," Tommy would joke, watching Frank restore a scuffed section of flooring to its original glory. "No magic," Frank would reply, "just patience." The other janitors called him the Ghost, because he could clean an entire floor without anyone noticing his presence. It wasn't about being invisible, it was about being considerate. He knew which executives arrived early and needed their offices ready first, which ones worked late and preferred their cleaning done in the morning, and which ones suffered from allergies and needed extra attention to dust. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, Frank would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he'd helped maintain for so long. He'd watch the sunset paint the surrounding buildings in gold and purple, remembering his father's words about the nobility of work well done. In those moments, he didn't feel invisible at all. He felt like a guardian, a keeper of order in this small corner of the world. His personal life was equally methodical. Sunday dinners with his sister Elena and her kids in Queens, Wednesday night dominoes with the old-timers in his neighborhood, and Saturday morning volunteering at the community center where his father had taught him to play chess. The center's director had offered him a paid position several times, but Frank always declined. "I already have a job," he'd say, And some things are better kept as gifts. The old-timers at the center would often ask why he never married, never had kids of his own. Frank would just smile and shrug, turning the conversation back to their families, their concerns, their lives. The truth was, between caring for his father and maintaining his work ethic, relationships had always seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. His sister Elena would try to set him up occasionally, but Frank's dedication to his responsibilities always took precedence. But Frank had his treasures. The letter his father wrote him before passing away, praising the man he'd become. The thank you card from Mrs. Thompson on the 32nd floor, the only executive who knew his name after he'd found and returned her lost wedding ring. The chess set his father had taught him on, now used to teach kids at the community center. These small tokens reminded him that a life of service wasn't a life unlived. It was just a different kind of richness. As he walked through the marble lobby each morning, polished to perfection by his own hands, Frank would straighten his name tag and remember his father's words about dignity. He might be invisible to most of the people rushing past him, but in his heart, he knew the truth. He was essential, a vital part of the building's heartbeat, keeping its rhythm steady and sure. Day after day, year after year, Sarah Blackwood had always prided herself on maintaining composure under pressure. Running a multi-billion-dollar corporation meant handling crisis after crisis with grace. But trapped in her own building's elevator, 44 floors above Manhattan, she felt that carefully constructed control beginning to crack. The board meeting had run later than usual, discussions about quarterly projections and market strategies stretching well past 9. Sarah had stayed even longer, reviewing acquisition proposals until her eyes burned. Now, at nearly 11, her Louboutin heels echoed in the empty corridor as she headed for the executive elevator, a private convenience she rarely appreciated until tonight. The first warning was subtle, a slight shudder as the car descended. Then darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie blue glow. Sarah pressed the emergency button. Once, twice, nothing. Her phone showed no service, an infamous dead spot in the elevator shaft that her tech team had never managed to fix. She looked at her reflection in the polished doors. CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, trapped like a mouse in a cage. Time moved strangely in the confined space. Sarah removed her designer blazer, already feeling sweat beneath her silk blouse. The air seemed thinner with each passing minute. She thought of her daughter Emma's 10th birthday party she'd missed last week, promising to make it up to her. This weekend, would she make it home tonight? The thought triggered something primal, something that didn't care about quarterly reports or board meetings. She began to pound on the doors, her usual dignified restraint abandoned. Her expensive heel snapped as she kicked the wall in frustration, the broken strap a perfect metaphor for her current situation. The carefully maintained facade was crumbling, just like her father had always predicted it would. "You can't control everything, Sarah," he'd say, but she'd spent 20 years proving him wrong, until now. The sound of movement outside the elevator sent hope surging through her chest. "Hello?" she called out, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Is anyone there?" The response came not in words, but in the grinding sound of metal on metal. Someone was manually prying the doors open. Sarah stepped back, watching as fingers appeared in the gap, then hands, straining with effort. The doors slowly parted, revealing a face she'd passed 100 times, but never truly seen. He was older than she'd expected, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. His uniform was perfectly pressed, despite the late hour, the name tag reading Frank Martinez gleaming under the emergency lights. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. There was no hesitation there, no calculation of risk or reward, just pure determination to help. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm going to need you to step closer to the doors." No questions about who she was, no surprise at finding the CEO trapped in her own building. Just calm, professional focus. The elevator car had stopped slightly below the floor level. Frank knelt, interlocking his fingers to create a step. "Please, use my hands as a boost. I won't let you fall." There was something in his tone that made her believe him completely. Sarah slipped off her broken heel, then its mate. With as much dignity as she could muster, she placed her hand on his shoulder and her foot in his cupped hands. His strength was surprising as he lifted her smoothly onto the floor, his movements careful but confident. Standing in the corridor, Sarah felt the tight band of panic around her chest finally loosen. She looked at her rescuer, really looked at him, as he retrieved her shoes and blazer from the elevator floor. His movements were efficient, respectful, and somehow graceful, despite the awkward angle. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez," she said, reading his name tag again, committing it to memory. He handed her belongings to her with a slight bow that didn't feel servile, but rather courteous in an old-world way. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he replied, but she caught something in his expression. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction in a duty well performed. He didn't hover or attempt to make conversation, simply asked if she needed medical attention or assistance calling security. When she declined, he nodded and began to push his cleaning cart down the hall, the squeaking wheel echoing in the empty space. Sarah watched him go, her CEO's mind already spinning with questions. Who was this man who acted with such quiet competence? What else had she missed by never really seeing the people who kept her building running? She pulled out her phone. Service restored now that she was out of the elevator. "Janet," she said when her assistant answered, despite the late hour, "I need everything you can find on Frank Martinez first thing tomorrow morning. And, Janet, mark this as priority 1. Dawn painted the Blackwood Tower in shades of amber as Frank arrived for his morning shift. Everything the same as it had been for 20 years, yet somehow different. The security footage from last night's incident played on a loop at the guard. Station Joe watching it with unusual interest. "Getting famous, Frank," Joe chuckled, pointing to the grainy black and white image of Frank prying open the elevator doors. "Building management's been asking for copies all morning." Frank just nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. He'd left out the identity of the woman in his incident report, writing simply, "Building occupant assisted from stuck elevator, floor, M44. Some things were better left unsaid. Up in her penthouse office, Sarah Blackwood sat at her desk, a manila folder open before her. Janet had been thorough, as always. Francisco Frank Martinez, age 47, 20 years of service. Perfect attendance. Record, not a single complaint. Several commendation letters from tenants, though most didn't even know his name. Night school credits in business administration. Certified in advanced building maintenance. Former caregiver to his late father. What caught her attention wasn't the facts. It was what lay between them. The pattern of a man who consistently chose to better himself while remaining in service to others. Her father would have called it character. Sarah called it potential. The security footage played on her laptop, showing the rescue from multiple angles. She watched herself emerge from the elevator, disheveled but safe, thanks to the quick thinking of a man who could have simply called maintenance and waited for protocol to take its course. "Ms. Blackwood," Janet's voice came through the intercom. "The board members are asking about the elevator incident. They're concerned about liability." Sarah smiled, remembering a time when she'd have shared their concerns. "Tell them it's being handled," she replied, closing the folder. "And Janet, schedule a meeting with HR. I want to review our internal promotion policies." Meanwhile, Frank went about his morning routine, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him through the lobby. The overnight security team had talked, and now everyone knew about the rescue. His fellow maintenance workers clapped him on the back, making jokes about him being a hero. "Just doing my job," he'd reply, the same words he'd said to the woman in the elevator. He thought about her now, how she'd maintained her dignity even in distress. He'd seen plenty of executives lose their composure over far less. The morning passed in a blur of familiar tasks, though Frank found himself paying extra attention to the executive floor. He noticed things he'd never considered before. The family. Photos on Ms. Blackwood's desk visible through her office windows. The way her assistant organized papers with meticulous care. The fresh flowers delivered every Monday morning. Around noon, his supervisor approached, looking uncomfortable. "Frank, you got a minute?" The man shifted from foot to foot, clutching a clipboard. "Just got a request from upstairs. They want to see your maintenance certificates, all of them, and your education records." Frank felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. Was there trouble about the elevator? Had he broken some protocol he didn't know about? "Everything's in order," he said calmly, though his mind raced. "I'll bring them in tomorrow." "They want them today, Frank, and—" The supervisor paused. "They're asking about your availability for a meeting. Upstairs." The word upstairs held special meaning in the Blackwood Tower. Upstairs meant the executive. Floor meant power, meant the kind of people who didn't usually concern themselves with janitors. Frank thought of his father's words about dignity. Whatever was coming, he would face it with the same quiet pride he brought to every task. "I'll get those documents for you right away," he said, already mentally cataloguing where each certificate was stored in his apartment. As the day wound down, both Sarah and Frank felt the weight of approaching change. In her office, Sarah reviewed Frank's file one more time, growing more certain of her unorthodox plan. She thought of her father, who'd started as a stock boy and built Blackwood Enterprises through sheer determination and an eye for untapped potential. In the basement locker room, Frank changed out of his uniform, carefully hanging it up for tomorrow. The security footage still played at the guard station as he left, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he thought about his father's photo on his dresser at home and wondered what tomorrow might bring. The executive floor access card felt foreign in Frank's hand, its sleek surface a stark contrast to his calloused fingers. He stood before the private elevator, the same one he'd opened 2 nights ago, dressed in his best clothes, a navy blue suit he'd worn to his father's funeral, pressed meticulously the night before. His certificates and diplomas were tucked into a worn leather portfolio, another inheritance from his father. The overnight maintenance crew had whistled when he walked. Through the lobby, Miguel calling out, "Looking sharp, jefe." But now, alone in the elevator, Frank felt every bit the janitor playing dress-up. The car moved smoothly, no hint of the malfunction that had started this whole situation. Frank watched the floor numbers climb, 20, 30, 40, each chime bringing him closer to whatever waited above. He straightened his tie, a simple blue stripe that Elena had given him last Christmas, still in its original box until today. The elevator doors opened to a world Frank knew intimately, yet had never truly been part of. He'd polished these marble floors countless times, but never walked them in dress shoes. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. He usually cleaned before dawn, casting long shadows across the reception area. Janet, Ms. Blackwood's assistant, looked up from her desk. Her eyes widened slightly, whether from surprise at his transformation or recognition of the man from the security footage. Frank couldn't tell. "Mr. Martinez," she said, rising with a warm smile that seemed genuine. "Ms. Blackwood is expecting you. Would you like coffee?" Before Frank could answer, Sarah Blackwood appeared in her office doorway. She'd changed from his mental image of her as the trapped woman in designer clothes. Today, she wore a simple charcoal suit that somehow made her more imposing, not less. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in his appearance with apparent approval. "Mr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "Please come in." Her handshake was firm, professional, but there was something else in her manner, a hint of the vulnerability he'd witnessed in the elevator, now transformed into something like kinship. Sarah's office was larger than Frank's entire apartment, with views of Manhattan that made the city look like a model train set. He'd washed these windows hundreds of times, but had never stopped to appreciate the view from this side. "Please sit." Sarah gestured to a leather chair that probably cost more than his yearly salary. As he settled in, trying not to appear as out of place as he felt, She didn't take her usual place behind the imposing desk. Instead, she chose the chair opposite his, reducing the distance between them, both physically and symbolically. "I've been reading about you, Mr. Martinez," she began, touching a familiar manila folder on the coffee table between them. 20 years of service, perfect attendance, multiple certifications, night school." She paused, meeting his eyes. "Why did you never apply for a management position?" Frank thought carefully before answering, his father's words about dignity echoing in his mind. "My father taught me that every job has its own kind of honor," he said finally. "I never felt I needed a title to take pride in my work." Something flickered in Sarah's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "My father started in the mailroom," she said quietly. "He used to tell me that true character shows in how you treat people when you think no one's watching." She leaned forward slightly. "I've watched the security footage from that night, Mr. Martinez, but more importantly, I've watched other footage. Hours of you working when you thought no one was looking. Always thorough, always professional, always treating this building and everyone in it with respect." Frank felt the weight of her words, the careful observation they represented. "Thank you, ma'am." "Sarah," she corrected, then stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Do you know what I see when I look out here, Mr. Martinez? I see potential. Thousands of people, millions of stories, endless possibilities." She turned back to him. "But sometimes we miss the potential right in front of us because we're too busy looking at the horizon." She returned to her seat, her movements deliberate. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Martinez. One that might seem unusual, perhaps even uncomfortable at first. But before I make it, I need to know something." She paused, studying his face. "Are you ready for your life to change?" Frank sat at his small kitchen table, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the resignation letter he'd written and rewritten 5 times. Sarah Blackwood's offer echoed in his mind. Director of Operations for the entire Blackwood enterprise. Portfolio, travel, responsibility, a salary that made him dizzy just thinking about it. A life so far removed from his current one that it felt like a dream. "We need someone who understands buildings from the ground up," she'd said. "Someone who sees the details others miss. Someone who knows the difference between managing things and understanding them." Her words had been carefully chosen, respectful of his current position, while illuminating the path to something more. The worn chess set his father had given him sat open on the table, the pieces arranged mid-game, just as he'd left them after. His last session teaching kids at the community center. He picked up the knight, feeling its familiar weight. His father had taught him that the knight was special, the only piece that could jump over others, change direction, see the board from a different angle. "Frankie?" Elena's voice carried through the apartment as she let herself in with her spare key. His sister took one look at him in his suit, the papers spread across the table, and stopped short. "What's going on, hermano?" He told her everything. The elevator rescue, the meeting, the offer. Elena listened without interrupting, her eyes growing wider with each detail. When he finished, she sat heavily in the chair across from him. "Papa would be proud," she said finally, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "But he'd also tell you to think it through carefully. This isn't just a new job, Frankie. This is a new life." She was right, of course. The position came with expectations. Corporate dinners, business travel, responsibility for hundreds of employees. He'd be leaving behind the quiet certainty of his routines, the satisfaction of tangible work well done. His phone buzzed, a text from Tommy, the young weekend janitor. "Mr. M, heard rumors you're headed upstairs. Hope it's true. You taught me more about respect and hard work in 6 months than anyone else in my whole life." Frank set the phone down, thinking about all the Tommies in the buildings he'd be overseeing, all the invisible workers keeping the wheels turning. Maybe that's what Sarah Blackwood had seen in him. Not just his ability to do the work, but his understanding of the people who did it, The sunset painted his small apartment in shades of orange and purple, the same colors he'd watched play across the city countless times from behind the windows he kept clean. He remembered Sarah's words about seeing potential, about looking right in front of you instead of always at the horizon. His father's voice came back to him, clear as yesterday. Dignity isn't in what you do, Hijo. It's in how you do it. Frank had always thought that meant finding honor in humble work. But maybe it also meant having the courage to step into something bigger when the opportunity arose. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper, starting his resignation letter one final time. This version came easier, the words flowing from a place of certainty rather than doubt. Dear Mr. Sullivan, I am writing to formally resign from my position as maintenance staff at Blackwood Tower, effective 2 weeks from today. The past 20 years have been a privilege, teaching me lessons about service, dignity, and excellence that I will carry forward into my new role. Elena read over his shoulder, her hand resting supportively on his back. You're really doing this, she said, and it wasn't a question. I'm really doing this, Frank confirmed, signing his name with the same care he'd always taken with building. Reports and maintenance logs. He folded the letter precisely, squaring the corners with habitual attention to detail. Looking around his apartment, at the life he'd built here, Frank felt not sadness, but a quiet appreciation. Every certificate on the wall, every saved penny, every late night of study, they hadn't been preparation for this specific opportunity, but they had prepared him nonetheless. He picked up his phone to call Sarah's direct line, the number she'd impersonally written on her business card. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. Miss Blackwood, this is Frank Martinez. He paused, looking at his father's photograph on the dresser. I'd be honored to accept the position. Her response was warm but unsurprised, as if she'd known his answer before he did. Excellent. And Frank, remember what I said. Call me Sarah. We're going to be working very closely together. After hanging up, Frank stood at his window looking out at the city. Tomorrow would bring 1,000 changes, challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, in the growing darkness, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The quiet excitement of stepping into the unknown, armed with nothing but his father's wisdom and his own hard-earned principles. The morning sunlight struck the mahogany desk in Frank's new office, his office, casting a warm glow across the leather chair he still didn't feel comfortable sitting in. His maintenance uniform had been replaced by a charcoal grey suit from Brooks Brothers, courtesy of the corporate styling team Sarah had insisted on. Image matters in this world, she'd said, even if we both know it shouldn't. The wall of windows behind him offered the same view he'd cleaned countless times, now permanently his to admire. 44th floor, corner office, right next to Sarah's. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. This was the same floor where he'd heard her pounding on the elevator doors that fateful night. Mr. Martinez, his new assistant, Kevin, appeared at the door. Your first executive meeting starts in 10 minutes. Would you like me to walk you through the agenda? Frank nodded, grateful for the young man's patience with his endless questions about corporate protocol. Kevin had been handpicked by Sarah's assistant, Janet, and his quiet efficiency reminded Frank of himself at that age, eager to prove his worth through action rather than words. The conference room was already full when Frank arrived. Faces he'd known for years only as early morning glimpses or evening shadows now turned to study him openly. Richard Chen, VP of Finance, who'd never once looked up from his phone when passing Frank in the hallway, now offered a practiced smile. Patricia Morrison from Legal, whose office he'd cleaned at 4 a.m. for 15 years, seemed unable to reconcile the man in the suit with the one who'd emptied her wastebasket. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her presence both commanding and reassuring. She'd spent the past week personally introducing Frank to key personnel, her support clear and unwavering. Now she gestured to the empty chair to her right, her clear signal to the room about his new status. Let's begin with operations. Sarah said, nodding to Frank. Mr. Martinez has completed his initial review of our building management systems across all properties. Frank took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about dignity. He opened the leather portfolio, new, a gift from Elena, and began to speak. Thank you, Ms. Blackwood. During my assessment, I've identified several areas where we can improve both efficiency and employee satisfaction. He walked them through his findings, pointing out patterns that only someone who'd worked from the ground up would notice. The way the night shift scheduling created unnecessary overlap in some buildings while leaving gaps in others. How certain maintenance protocols actually created more work while solving nothing. The hidden costs of cheap supplies versus quality ones. In the Martinez building alone, he continued, then caught himself. Excuse me, the Martinez Tower. The room rippled with subtle reactions to his slip, but Sarah's slight smile encouraged him to continue. We could reduce operational costs by 12%, while improving working conditions by implementing these adjustments. Richard Chen leaned forward, frowning at the spreadsheet Frank had distributed. These numbers, they're remarkably detailed. You compiled all this yourself? Yes, sir, Frank replied, keeping his voice steady. 20 years of observation, plus the night school accounting courses I completed at Borough of Manhattan Community College. The room fell silent. Frank could feel them reassessing him, their preconceptions shifting uncomfortably. Sarah's voice broke the tension. This is exactly why Mr. Martinez was the perfect choice for this position. He brings a perspective we desperately needed. As the meeting continued, Frank felt himself settling into a strange, new rhythm. He'd spent decades being invisible in rooms like this, absorbing their dynamics, learning their patterns. Now he was part of the pattern, his voice carrying weight, his observations demanding attention. After the meeting, Sarah held him back. You did well, she said, straightening a stack of papers with habitual precision. But I saw you hesitate a few times. Remember, Frank, you earned this position. Your experience is your strength, not your weakness. Frank nodded, thinking of the maintenance staff he'd seen that morning, their uncertain waves and awkward greetings. He was walking between worlds now, no longer fully part of either. It's an adjustment, he admitted. Of course it is, Sarah replied, her tone softening. But that's exactly why we need you. This company has plenty of executives who've never cleaned their own offices. What we needed was someone who understands both the boardroom and the boiler room. She paused, studying him. Just keep being who you are, Frank. That's why I chose you. Walking back to his office, Frank passed the executive elevator where it had all begun. The maintenance team had finally fixed the dead spot in cell service, one of his first approved projects. Small changes, he thought, but meaningful ones. One floor at a time, one decision at a time, he would prove that Sarah's faith in him wasn't misplaced. Frank stood in the basement of the Chen building, Blackwood Enterprises' troubled Los Angeles acquisition, listening to the hum of machinery that others might have missed. Around him, consultants in expensive suits clutched tablets displaying complex efficiency reports, while building managers rattled off statistics about the property's declining performance. The numbers don't add up, Richard Chen was saying, his frustration evident. We've pumped millions into modernizing this building, but operating costs are still 30% higher than our other properties. He turned to Frank. You've been quiet, Martinez. Any insights? Frank held up his hand, silencing the mechanical chorus of explanations and excuses. Listen, he said softly. The group fell quiet, faces puzzled. That sound, the ventilation system, it's fighting itself. He walked over to a maintenance panel, one that the modernization team had covered with sleek new digital controls. But Frank knew what lay beneath. He'd seen it 1,000 times in older buildings, the ghost of old systems haunting new installations. May I? He asked the building manager, who nodded uncertainly. Frank pulled off the digital panel, revealing the original analog controls behind it. Here's your problem. The new system is trying to regulate temperature without understanding the building's original design. It's like putting a Ferrari engine in a classic Mustang without adjusting the transmission. Sarah, who had been observing quietly from the back, stepped forward. "Can it be fixed?" Frank nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. "The bones of this building are solid. We just need to help the old and new systems talk to each other." He turned to the maintenance staff hovering nearby. "Who here knows this building best?" An older man in a worn uniform stepped forward. "I've been here 23 years, sir." "Sir?" Frank smiled, recognizing himself from not so long ago. "Call me Frank. Tell me about this building's rhythms. How does it breathe?" For the next hour, Frank and the maintenance man, Carlos, walked the group through the building's hidden infrastructure. Frank translated Carlos's practical knowledge into business terms the executives could understand, while demonstrating hands-on solutions that would save millions in operating costs. The modernization team missed this because they never asked the right people, Frank explained, sketching a diagram on his tablet. Carlos and his team know every quirk of this building, every seasonal change, every pressure point. That knowledge is worth more than any efficiency report. Richard Chen studied the diagram, his expression shifting from skepticism to respect. "How long to implement these changes?" 2 weeks, Frank replied confidently. "Using the existing maintenance team with some additional training. No outside contractors needed." Later, in Sarah's temporary office overlooking the Los Angeles skyline, she handed Frank a glass of water, her own celebration choice, instead of the customary executive scotch. "You know what impressed me most today?" she asked, settling into a chair beside him rather than behind her desk. "Not the technical solution, though that was brilliant. It was how you treated Carlos and his team." Frank looked down at his hands, clean now, but forever marked by years of similar work. "They're the heart of these buildings. Always have been." "Exactly," Sarah smiled. "Which is why our next phase of modernization will be different. I want you to develop a program, company-wide, that integrates maintenance staff knowledge into our improvement plans. Show me a budget next week." Frank felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the rightness of it. "I already have some ideas," he admitted. "Been thinking about it since my first day on the other side." "Of course you have," Sarah laughed softly. "That's why you're here." She paused, considering him. "You know, my father used to say that true innovation often comes from the most unexpected places." He'd have liked you, Frank. The Los Angeles sunset painted the office in shades of gold, reminding Frank of countless evenings, watching similar colors play across different buildings, different cities, always from the outside looking in. Now he was on the inside, but carrying with him every lesson, every observation, every hard-earned bit of wisdom from his years of invisible work. His phone buzzed. A message from Carlos sharing photos of the mechanical room's original blueprints, found in a forgotten filing cabinet. Frank smiled, remembering how he used to treasure such discoveries in his own building. He looked up to find Sarah watching him with knowing eyes. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied. "Just thinking about how sometimes the best way forward is to really understand where you've been." She stood, gathering her papers. "Come on, we've got dinner with the board. Time to share your maintenance revolution with the people who sign the checks." Frank straightened his tie, a gesture that was becoming more natural, and followed her out, his mind already mapping the connections between the basement and the boardroom, the past and the future, the invisible and the seen. It started with a coffee stain. 3 months into his new position, Frank noticed the cleaning staff had missed a small brown circle on the conference room table before the morning's board meeting. Unusual. Maria's team was always thorough. He grabbed a cloth from his desk drawer, old habits die hard, and went to clean it himself. That's when he saw the document left beneath a stack of folders. Not meant for his eyes, certainly, but years of sorting through discarded papers for sensitive materials had trained him well. The header caught his attention. Project Phoenix, Restructuring Proposal. Frank wouldn't have thought twice about it except for one detail. The document used letterhead from Chen International Holdings, Richard Chen's family company, not Blackwood Enterprises. And there, in crisp black ink, was a proposal to spin off the property management division, Sarah's primary area of control since her father's death. Something interesting in those coffee rings. Frank straightened up to find Janet, Sarah's assistant, watching him from the doorway. 25 years as Sarah's right hand had given her an almost supernatural ability to appear when secrets were at risk of exposure. Just helping Maria's team, Frank replied carefully, but Janet's expression told him she wasn't buying it. She closed the door behind her. "You found it, didn't you?" She moved closer, speaking softly despite the empty room. "The Phoenix proposal. I've been trying to get proof for weeks." Frank studied her face, remembering how she'd been the first to welcome him to the executive floor. "How long has this been in motion?" "Since before your promotion." Janet's lips tightened. "Richard Chen's been quietly buying shares through subsidiary companies. He needs Sarah distracted while he builds support on the board." The pieces clicked into place. The sudden enthusiasm for his maintenance revolution program, the increased scrutiny of property division budgets, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. "Does Sarah know?" Janet shook her head. "She suspects something's coming, but not this. Not from Richard. Their fathers built these companies together. She trusts him." Frank thought about Sarah's father, the man who'd started in the mailroom, who'd taught his daughter to see potential in unexpected places. Would he have seen this coming? "Why tell me?" Frank asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Because you see things others miss," Janet replied. "You understand how buildings work, yes, but more importantly, you understand how people work, how they move, what they hide, where they leave traces." She gestured to the coffee stain. Case in point. Frank carefully photographed the document, with his phone before returning it exactly as he'd found it. "We need more proof," he said, "and we need to understand exactly what they're planning." Janet smiled grimly. "Now you're thinking like an executive, but be careful. Richard's team is smart. They wouldn't have left this if they weren't confident in their position." Throughout the day, Frank watched the office with new eyes. He noticed how Richard's team had slowly positioned themselves in key roles throughout the property division, how casual suggestions had gradually shifted responsibility away from Sarah's direct oversight. In his afternoon meeting with Sarah, he found himself studying her with concern. She looked tired, the weight of unnamed worries evident in the set of her shoulders. "Everything all right?" she asked, catching his gaze. Frank thought about the document, about Janet's warning, about the weight of loyalty versus truth. "Just thinking about something my father used to say," he replied carefully, "about how sometimes the biggest threats aren't the ones making noise, but the ones moving quietly in the background." Sarah's hand stilled over her keyboard. "Like that summer we found black mold in the Madison building. Nobody saw it until it had spread through half the ventilation system." "Exactly." Frank leaned forward. "Miss Blackwood, Sarah, when was the last time you did a full audit of the property division's reporting structure?" She frowned. "It's been... Actually, I'm not sure. Richard's team has been handling most of that lately." She paused, something shifting in her expression. "Why do you ask?" "Just thinking it might be time for a closer look at everything." He met her eyes, willing her to understand the weight behind his words. Sometimes systems that seem to be running smoothly are actually fighting themselves, like that building in Los Angeles. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her father's shrewd business instincts warring with her natural trust in old friends. Finally, she nodded. "Set it up. Full audit, complete transparency. And Frank, let's keep this between us for now." As he left her office, Frank caught Richard Chen watching him from down the hall, his expression unreadable. The game was changing, and Frank realized he'd have to learn new rules. Fast. The skills that had served him well in maintenance wouldn't be enough anymore. Now he needed to understand a different kind of system, one where the dangers weren't in failing machinery, but in failing trust. Frank stared at the presentation slides on his office computer. his father's voice echoing in his memory. Sometimes, the best way to fix a broken system is to rebuild it from scratch. The Enterprise-Wide Maintenance Integration Program, EMIP, as the board had labeled it, represented everything he'd learned in his decades of service, transformed into a corporate initiative that could reshape how Blackwood Enterprises managed its properties. But with Project Phoenix lurking in the shadows, Frank knew this presentation wasn't just about maintenance protocols and efficiency metrics. It was his first real test as an executive, and possibly Sarah's best defense against Richard Chen's attempted takeover. "The board meeting starts in an hour," Kevin reminded him, placing a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. "Mr. Chen's office called twice to confirm you'll be covering the cost projections in detail." Of course they had. Richard's team had been particularly interested in any numbers they could use to challenge Sarah's leadership. Frank had spent weeks ensuring his proposal was bulletproof, working late into the night with maintenance teams across the country, gathering data that even Richard's accountants couldn't dispute. His phone buzzed, a text from Elena. "Knock them dead, hermano. Papa would be so proud." Attached was a photo of his father's old work ID, the one where he stood straight-backed in his maintenance uniform, dignity radiating from every line of his face. Sarah appeared in his doorway, her presence both supportive and anxious. "Ready?" "Almost." Frank adjusted his tie, a new one, deep blue silk, a gift from Sarah for his 6-month anniversary in the position. "Just reviewing the numbers one last time." She closed the door and sat down, her usual corporate poise softening slightly. "This isn't just about EMIP, is it?" "No," Frank admitted. "Richard's team will use this to gauge our vulnerability. If they can prove we're wasting resources on maintenance reforms, they strengthen their argument for spinning off the property." "Division," Sarah finished. "But you know what they don't understand, Frank. They see buildings as assets on a balance sheet. You see them as living things." The conference room filled quickly, board members and executives settling into their usual positions of power and influence. Richard Chen sat directly opposite Frank, his smile pleasant, but his eyes sharp as a maintenance worker's blade. "Mr. Martinez," Richard nodded, "I understand this program of yours touches every property in our portfolio. Quite ambitious for someone so new to executive leadership." Frank stood, remembering how he'd once cleaned this very room in pre-dawn darkness. "Ambitious, yes, but necessary." He launched the presentation, his voice finding strength in conviction. "For decades, we've treated maintenance as a cost center rather than an investment opportunity. Today, I'm going to show you why that mindset has cost us millions and how we're going to fix it." Over the next hour, Frank laid out his vision. He showed how integrating maintenance staff knowledge into planning phases could prevent costly retrofits, how standardizing high-quality materials across properties would actually reduce long-term expenses, how investing in training and career development for maintenance teams would slash turnover rates and preserve institutional knowledge. "In the Chen building in Los Angeles," he noted, watching Richard's expression carefully, "this approach has already reduced operating costs by 28%, more than double our initial projections." Richard leaned forward. "Impressive numbers, Mr. Martinez, but the implementation costs across all properties are offset within 8 months. Frank interrupted smoothly, switching to his final slides. "I've included a detailed breakdown of costs versus projected savings, verified by 3 independent auditing firms. Firms that Janet had quietly confirmed had no ties to Chen International Holdings." The board members murmured, flipping through the comprehensive reports Frank had provided. He could see the momentum shifting, the numbers too compelling to dismiss. "There's something else," Frank continued, sensing his moment. "This program doesn't just save money, it creates a unified maintenance standard across all Blackwood properties, one that would make any attempt to separate or sell off properties significantly less profitable." The room fell silent. Richard's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. This was new information. A strategic dimension to EMIP she hadn't anticipated. Making our infrastructure more efficient makes it more valuable, Frank concluded. But making it more integrated makes it more secure. I learned that lesson maintaining these buildings for 20 years. Some systems work best when they're kept together. The board voted unanimously to approve EMIP, with immediate implementation across all properties. As the room cleared, Richard lingered, his expression unreadable. Well played, Mr. Martinez. I underestimated you. A lot of people have, Frank replied quietly, usually while looking down. Later, in Sarah's office, she poured them both sparkling water. You didn't just present a maintenance program today, she said. You created a corporate defense strategy disguised as a maintenance program. Frank smiled, thinking of all the years he'd spent learning how buildings protected themselves against external threats. Sometimes the best security isn't in the locks or cameras, he said. It's in how tightly everything works together. Sarah raised her glass. To working together then, and to whatever comes next. Frank clinked his glass against hers, knowing that Richard Chen's team would be regrouping, planning their next move. But for now, he had proven himself not just to the board, but to himself. His father had been right. Dignity wasn't in what you did, but how you did it. Even in the corporate battlefield, those words still held true. The card appeared on Frank's desk 1 month after EMIP's implementation. Cream-colored stationery with elegant handwriting. Thank you for seeing us. It was signed by Maria's entire cleaning crew, the same team he'd worked alongside for years. But it wasn't the only change he'd noticed since his program began transforming Blackwood's properties. Walking through the Madison Building's lobby, Frank watched as a maintenance worker confidently approached the property manager, blueprints in hand, pointing out potential improvements. In Los Angeles, Carlos had been promoted to Building Systems Coordinator, a position Frank had created specifically to bridge the gap between maintenance and management. The old hierarchies were shifting, slowly but surely. Your fan club is growing, Sarah commented, falling into step beside him as they headed to their weekly operations review. She handed him a financial report. EMIP's results are exceeding even your projections. The board can't stop talking about it. Frank scanned the numbers, noting with satisfaction how the maintenance team's suggestions had translated into measurable improvements. But something else caught his eye, a pattern in the data he might have missed in his old life. Look at these energy usage spikes in the Chen building, he said, pointing to a graph. They don't match the occupancy patterns. Sarah frowned. Could be a system malfunction, or someone trying to hide something. Frank thought about Richard Chen's recent interest in their West Coast properties. Mind if I look into it? You're the director of operations. Sarah smiled. That's literally your job now. The title still felt strange sometimes, like a suit that hadn't quite settled on his shoulders. But as Frank dug deeper into the Chen building's operations, he found himself moving with increasing confidence between his old world and his new one. He assembled a small team, Carlos from Los Angeles, 2 senior maintenance workers, and a junior analyst from Richard's department, who'd been surprisingly eager to help. Together, they uncovered a complex web of unauthorized system modifications, all designed to mask unusual activity in the building's secure server rooms. They're using our building's power grid to run something big, the analyst explained, pointing to heat mapping data, something they don't want anyone to notice. Frank thought about Richard's recent board meeting comments about innovative technological solutions for Project Phoenix. Can we find out what they're running? Not directly, Carlos said, but we can track the power usage patterns. Whatever it is, it's pulling enough electricity to run a small data center. Frank remembered something his father once said about solving problems. Sometimes you don't need to see inside a locked room to know what's happening. Just listen to the walls. He spent the next week gathering evidence, carefully documenting every anomaly, every hidden system modification. The maintenance teams, energized by their new authority under EMIP, provided detailed records of suspicious requests and unusual access patterns. When Frank finally presented his findings to Sarah, her face grew increasingly serious. "They're using our infrastructure to build their takeover platform," she realized, "running their operations right under our noses, probably gathering data they shouldn't have access to." "Yes," Frank agreed, "but they made one mistake. They forgot that buildings talk to those who know how to listen. The evidence was irrefutable. Richard's team had violated multiple corporate policies, building codes, and possibly federal regulations. More importantly, they'd proven that splitting the property division would compromise the company's security. Sarah called an emergency board meeting. This time, Frank sat beside her as a full equal, his quiet confidence filling the room as she laid out their discoveries. Richard Chen's face remained impassive, but his fingers drummed an anxious rhythm on the conference table. "Thanks to Mr. Martinez's implementation of EMIP," Sarah concluded, "we've identified critical security vulnerabilities that must be addressed immediately. I move to suspend all discussions of restructuring until a full audit is complete." The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, several stopped to shake Frank's hand. Even Patricia Morrison from legal lingered to say, "I never thought I'd say this to my former janitor, but brilliant work, Mr. Martinez." Later, alone in his office, Frank found another card on his desk. This one was from Janet. "Your father would be proud. We all are." Beneath it lay a maintenance report from his first year at Blackwood Tower, his careful handwriting noting a faulty air conditioning unit on the 44th floor. He'd fixed it himself, staying late to ensure the executive offices would be comfortable the next day. Frank smiled, touching the old report gently. He'd come so far from those days, yet in many ways, he was still doing what he'd always done, caring for the building and its people, just from a different floor. The view might have changed, but his fundamental purpose hadn't. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dinner? We should celebrate. And I have some ideas about where EMIP should go next." Frank looked out at the city skyline. The same view. He'd cleaned for 20 years, now his to shape and protect. "On my way," he replied, ready for whatever came next. Blackwood's Cinderella story, from janitor to executive, the man behind the miracle. Frank stared at the Wall Street Journal article Elena had proudly framed for his office wall, still uncomfortable with the attention. The story had sparked a media frenzy, with business magazines hailing him as a symbol of corporate meritocracy and social mobility. But it was the tabloid headlines that made him wince. "Romance in the boardroom? Blackwood CEO's special interest. Informer maintenance. Man raises eyebrows." The Sunday dinner table at Elena's house had grown unusually quiet as she pushed the gossip magazine across to him. His niece Maria, usually bubbling with teenage enthusiasm, watched him with worried eyes. "They're saying ugly things, Tio Frank," she said softly, "about you and Miss Blackwood." Frank set his fork down, the arroz con gandules his sister had made suddenly tasteless. "People will always talk, Mika. What matters is what's true." But what was true had become increasingly complicated. The long strategy sessions with Sarah had evolved into working dinners, comfortable silences, shared jokes about corporate life. She'd started calling him at odd hours, not always about business, just to share thoughts or ask his opinion. He found himself noticing things he shouldn't, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when deep in thought, how her professional facade softened when they were alone. "You've been spending a lot of time with her," Eleanor observed after the kids had left the table. "And don't tell me it's just business. I know that look, hermano." "What look?" "The same one Papa used to get when he talked about Mama. Like you found something precious and you're afraid to admit it." Frank pushed back from the table, moving to the window where the city lights twinkled like fallen stars. "It's complicated, Eleanor. She's my boss. She's the CEO. And after everything with Richard Chen, life is always complicated. Eleanor interrupted. But love is simple. It either is or it isn't. Monday morning brought fresh challenges. The maintenance teams, once his closest colleagues, now treated him with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He'd catch them whispering, conversations stopping when he approached. The executive floor wasn't much better. Subtle glances, meaningful. Pauses, careful observations of his interactions with Sarah. "They're calling you her special project," Janet warned him during a quiet moment. "Richard's people are spreading rumors that your promotion was personal rather than professional." Frank thought about the decades of hard work, the night, school classes, the careful attention to every detail that had led to this position. "Let them talk," he said firmly. "The truth is in the results." But the situation came to a head during a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Frank stood uncomfortable in his tuxedo, another gift from the corporate styling team, watching Sarah work the room with practiced ease. She wore deep blue, elegant and understated, commanding attention without demanding it. Quite a view, isn't it? Richard Chen appeared beside him, champagne in hand. "Though I'm not sure if you're admiring the art or the artist." "The Monet is beautiful," Frank replied carefully, nodding toward the nearest painting. "That's a Manet," Richard corrected with a thin smile. "You know, Frank, you've surprised us all with your rapid adaptation to executive life. But some things, art, wine, certain social complexities, they take generations to truly understand." Before Frank could respond, Sarah approached them. "Frank, there's someone I'd like you to meet." She placed her hand lightly on his arm, a gesture both professional and intimate. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. The potential investor Sarah introduced him to was impressed by EMIP's results, but Frank felt the weight of Richard's words throughout the conversation. He excused himself early, seeking quiet in the museum's sculpture garden. Sarah found him there, the city noise muffled by marble walls and careful landscaping. "You left without saying goodbye. I needed some air." Frank turned to face her. "Sarah, people are talking about us, about why you chose me for this position." "People always talk," she echoed his words to Maria. "Does it bother you?" "Not for myself," he admitted, "but for you. Your reputation." Sarah stepped closer, her perfume mixing with the garden's roses. "Frank, do you know why I really chose you that night? Not just because you saved me, but because when you opened those elevator doors, you didn't see the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises. You just saw someone who needed help." "And now," Frank asked quietly, "what do you see when you look at me?" Matilda. Moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. A photographer's flash from the gala windows brought them back to reality, reminding them of their public roles, their professional responsibilities. Sarah stepped back slightly, but her eyes held his. "I see someone who makes me question everything. I thought I knew about success, about worth, about—" She paused. "About what matters most." Frank walked her back to the gala, both of them aware that tomorrow would bring fresh headlines, new rumors, greater scrutiny. But for the first time, he wondered if Elena might be right. If beneath all the complications, something simple and true was trying to emerge. The emergency board meeting was called at dawn, the kind of hour when Frank would have once been cleaning these same conference rooms. Now, he sat beside Sarah, watching Richard Chen deliver the presentation that threatened to tear everything apart. "The evidence is clear," Richard stated, clicking through slides of carefully curated data. "The market perceives a conflict of interest in our current leadership structure. Our stock has dropped 12% since the media began speculating about personal relationships within senior management." Frank felt the weight of every glance, the whispers barely contained. The morning's headlines hadn't helped. Blackwood Enterprises, corporate fairy tale or management crisis. But it was the next slide that made his blood run cold. Someone had photographed him and Sarah in the museum garden, the image carefully angled to make their private conversation appear intimate, inappropriate. The timestamp showed it was taken moments before they'd noticed the camera flash. The board has a responsibility to protect shareholder value, Richard continued smoothly. I move to separate the property management division into an independent entity, with new leadership appointed by an external committee. Sarah's hand tightened on her pen, the only sign of her distress. This is a transparent attempt to exploit tabloid gossip for corporate gain, she said, her voice steady. The property division's performance under Mr. Martinez's leadership has been exceptional, which is precisely why he should have no objection to heading the new independent division, Richard interrupted, away from any appearance of impropriety. The he implied meaning was clear: separate Frank and Sarah, or watch the company suffer. Frank thought of his father's words about dignity, about doing the right thing even when it hurt. He started to rise, ready to offer his resignation rather than damage Sarah's company. But before he could speak, Janet slipped into the room, placing a folder in front of Sarah. One look at its contents made Sarah's expression shift from defensive to triumphant. Before we vote on Mr. Chen's proposal, Sarah said, her voice carrying new authority, I believe the board should review these documents. She began distributing copies. These are records of unauthorized server access from the Chen building, traced directly to terminals registered to Chen International Holdings. Richard's composure cracked slightly. Frank watched the man's fingers drum against the table, the same nervous tell he'd noticed during previous confrontations. Additionally, Sarah continued, we have evidence of systematic data mining of Blackwoods, proprietary information, coinciding precisely with the power usage anomalies Mr. Martinez's team discovered. The timing suggests this corporate espionage began shortly after the first Project Phoenix documents were drafted. The board erupted in murmurs. Richard stood. These allegations are documented, Frank interrupted quietly, finding his voice. Every unauthorized access, every system modification, every attempt to hide the evidence. The buildings don't lie, Mr. Chen. They never have. Sarah pulled up her own presentation, showing how Frank's EMIP program had created an unbroken chain of documentation. The maintenance teams Mr. Martinez trained didn't just improve our efficiency, they created an accountability system that makes corporate theft impossible to hide. Furthermore, she added, her voice taking on an edge of steel, we've discovered that Chen International Holdings has been quietly acquiring Blackwood shares through shell companies, a violation of our shareholder agreement. The SEC has been notified. The room fell silent. Board members who had been avoiding Frank's eyes now stared at Richard, their expressions hardening as the scope of the deception became clear. Richard Chen gathered his papers with shaking hands. This isn't over, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, it is, Sarah replied. The board will receive formal resignation letters from Mr. Chen and his associates by end of day, or these findings go public tomorrow morning. After Richard stalked out, after the board voted unanimously to reject the division proposal and launch a full investigation, after the room slowly emptied, Frank and Sarah remained. The sunrise painted the city gold through the windows, reminiscent of countless mornings when he'd watched the same light while polishing these very windows. I was ready to resign, he admitted. To protect you, the company. Sarah turned to him, her professional mask falling away. I know, that's exactly why I couldn't let you. She moved closer, choice and consequence hanging in the air between them. Frank, I don't want to protect the company from you. I need you to help me protect it from people like Richard. And us? He asked quietly. The rumors, the perception. My father used to say that perception is just reality without proof, she smiled. We've given them proof of your value, your integrity, your right to be exactly where you are. She took his hand, a gesture that felt both revolutionary and perfectly natural. Maybe it's time we stopped letting others define what's possible. The morning sun warmed their joined hands on the conference table, witness to a moment when professional respect and personal truth finally aligned. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware that in a building that had once been Frank's whole world, something fundamental had shifted, not just in corporate power, but in the very definition of what someone could become. Late evening light filtered through the windows of Sarah's office as she and Frank sat surrounded by spreadsheets, strategic plans, and empty coffee cups. The aftermath of Richard's departure had left them with both opportunity and obligation, a chance to rebuild Blackwood Enterprises stronger than before, but also the responsibility to prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future. The board wants a complete restructuring plan by Monday, Sarah said, rubbing her temples, something that proves we've learned from this and can prevent it from happening again. Frank studied the organizational chart they'd been revising, thinking about how buildings worked, how every system depended on the others, how weakness in one area could compromise everything. "We've been looking at this wrong," he said finally. "We're trying to build better walls when we should be creating better connections." He reached for a fresh piece of paper, sketching quickly. "In the old days, I learned that the best way to protect a building wasn't to lock everything down. It was to make sure everyone who cared for it understood how their part connected to the whole." Sarah moved closer, watching as his diagram took shape. "Like you did with EMAP?" "Exactly, but bigger." Frank's pen moved faster as the idea crystallized. "We integrate everything, not just maintenance and operations, but all departments. Create transparency without losing security. Make it impossible for anyone to work in isolation like Richard did." He drew lines connecting different divisions, explaining how information could flow more freely while actually becoming more secure through mutual oversight. "We make everyone stakeholders in each other's success. When the maintenance team understands how their work affects finance, when finance sees how they impact operations, when everyone has skin in the game, they protect each other," Sarah finished, excitement building in her voice. "And we incentivize it. Profit sharing across divisions, cross-training programs, career development paths that encourage people to learn multiple aspects of the business." They worked through the night, their plan expanding beyond mere corporate restructuring into something revolutionary. Frank drew from his experiences at every level of the company, while Sarah applied her strategic vision and business acumen. Together, they created something neither could have conceived alone. Dawn found them still working, empty takeout containers pushed aside, the walls now covered with diagrams and flowcharts. Janet arrived early, took one look at them, and silently brought fresh coffee and bagels. "You two might want to freshen up before the executive team arrives," she suggested diplomatically. "They'll be here in an hour for the briefing." Frank looked down at his rumpled shirt, then at Sarah's disheveled hair and smiled. They probably looked like college students after an all-night study session rather than corporate leaders about to present a company-wide transformation plan. "Janet's right," Sarah laughed, running a hand through her hair. "I keep a change of clothes in my private bathroom. You should run home and—" "Already handled," Janet interrupted, producing a garment bag. "Elena dropped this off last night, when I called her. She said, and I quote, 'My brother may be a big shot executive now, but he still needs someone looking out for him.'" Frank felt a rush of gratitude for the women in his life who understood him so well. While he changed into the fresh suit, he could hear Sarah in the next room making calls, her voice energized despite the sleepless night. When they reconvened, both looking considerably more professional, Sarah caught his hand before he could reach for the door. "Frank, wait. Before everyone arrives, I need to say something." He turned, seeing in her eyes the same mix of professional passion and personal connection he'd been feeling all night. "Working with you like this," she continued, "seeing how you understand this company from every angle, how you care about every person in it. It proves what I've known since that night in the elevator. You belong here, not just in the company, but—" She paused, squeezing his hand. "Here, with me." Frank thought about the distance he'd traveled from his days cleaning these offices, about how that journey had led him not just to professional success, but to this moment, this woman, this perfect blend of purpose and possibility. "I used to watch the sunrise through these windows every morning," he said softly, "cleaning them so other people could see clearly. Now I'm helping build something that lets everyone see clearly, see their own value, their connection to something bigger." Sarah's smile held both understanding and promise. "Then let's show them that vision." The executive team arrived to find them professional and prepared. No sign of their all-night session, except the extensive plans covering the walls. As Frank began presenting their integrated transparency initiative, he felt Sarah's quiet support. Beside him, their personal and professional partnership strengthening each other. The old corporate structure, he explained, pointing to their diagrams, was like a building with walls but no windows. What we're proposing is more like a modern glass tower. Everyone can see how their work supports others, how they're all part of the same strong, beautiful whole. Looking at his audience's engaged expressions, Frank knew they were seeing what he and Sarah had created during their night of shared vision. Not just a corporate restructuring, but a new way of thinking about how people could work together, trust each other, build something lasting. Just as he and Sarah had done, personally and professionally, breaking down walls while building connections that made everything stronger. The transition wasn't smooth. Change never is, Frank had learned. Whether you're updating a building's systems or transforming a corporate culture, 3 months into implementing their integrated transparency initiative, resistance came from unexpected quarters. "The Singapore office is pushing back," Sarah reported during their morning briefing, her cell phone buzzing with urgent messages. "They're saying the new cross-departmental teams are causing confusion in the reporting structure. Houston has similar complaints," Frank added, reviewing emails from the previous night. "And the London maintenance crew is worried about the profit-sharing metrics." He understood their concerns. He'd once been the one worried about changes from above. "Maybe we moved too fast," Sarah sighed, the weight of leadership visible in her posture. They'd been working 14-hour days, flying between properties, explaining their vision again and again. The media had dubbed it the Martinez method, much to Frank's discomfort, but making it work was proving harder than creating it. Frank's phone lit up with a text from Carlos in Los Angeles. "Got that video you wanted? You need to see this." A link followed. "Put it on the screen," Sarah suggested, moving to stand behind Frank's chair, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. These small touches had become natural between them, professional boundaries softening into something more personal yet still appropriate. The video showed a maintenance worker in the Chen building giving a presentation to senior management about energy efficiency improvements. The young man spoke with confidence, using terms from both his technical background and his newly acquired business training. The executives were engaged, asking questions, treating him as a peer. "That's Michael Chen's son," Sarah noted, referring to Richard's younger brother, who'd retained his position after proving he wasn't involved in the takeover attempt. "He's actually taking notes." "This is happening everywhere," Frank said, pulling up reports from other properties. "Look, in Chicago, the accounting team is doing weekly walkthroughs with maintenance. In Toronto, they've started a mentor exchange program between departments." Sarah leaned closer to read, her perfume mixing with the coffee aroma in his office. "They're not just following the program," she realized. "They're expanding it on their own." The intercom buzzed. Janet's voice carried a note of urgency. "You both need to see this. Turn on CNBC." The financial news showed Blackwood's stock price soaring. The headline crawler explained why Blackwood's Martinez method drives record efficiency gains. Analysts predict industry-wide adoption. "It's working," Sarah breathed, squeezing Frank's shoulder. "Not just the numbers. The culture is actually changing." But celebrations were premature. Within hours, their progress faced its greatest test. A sophisticated cyber attack hit their network, targeting the new integrated systems. Someone was trying to prove that transparency meant vulnerability. Frank and his team worked through the night, his old maintenance instincts merging with his new executive authority. He coordinated with IT, facilities, and operations simultaneously, watching how his cross-trained teams adapted and responded. The attacks coming through the Singapore office, their head of cybersecurity reported. They're using the new integrated access protocols against us. Frank thought about building systems, about how pressure revealed both weaknesses and strengths. No, he said, studying the attack pattern. They think they are, but they don't understand how we built this. He explained quickly, using the building, metaphors that had become his trademark. It's like trying to break into a modern building by attacking the ventilation system. If the systems are truly integrated, every breach attempt triggers multiple responses. Sarah, who hadn't left his side during the crisis, caught on immediately. The transparency goes both ways. They can't move through our network without being seen from multiple angles. Exactly. Frank turned to the security team. Don't try to block them, track them. Every department they touch gives us another way to identify them. Within hours, they'd traced the attack to a shell company connected to Richard Chen. More importantly, they demonstrated that their integrated system was actually more secure than traditional corporate structures, not less. The next morning, exhausted but triumphant, Frank and Sarah stood in his office, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. The same view he'd admired for 20 years, now shared with someone who saw both its beauty and its potential. "You know what this reminds me of?" Sarah said softly. "That night in the elevator, I thought I was trapped, but I was actually about to be set free." She turned to face him. "You didn't just rescue me from an elevator, Frank. You showed me a whole new way of seeing things." Frank thought about his father's words, about dignity, about doing things the right way. The Martinez method wasn't really about systems or structures. It was about respect, about seeing the value in every person, every contribution, about building connections instead of walls. "We showed each other," he corrected gently, and in the golden morning light, their shared vision seemed to shine across the awakening city, transforming not just a company, but the very idea of what was possible when people chose to truly see each other. The Harvard Business Review cover story hit desks on a Tuesday morning. The Martinez Revolution, how a former janitor transformed corporate culture. The article detailed how Blackwood Enterprises' integrated transparency initiative had not only prevented a hostile takeover, but had become a new standard for corporate governance. Frank sat in his office, the magazine untouched on his desk, watching the maintenance team washing windows on the building across the street. Their movements were precise, coordinated, professional, just as his had been for so many years. But now they wore badges identifying them as building systems specialists, a title change that had come with increased training, better pay, and real career advancement opportunities. "Your fan club is getting bigger," Sarah said from his doorway, holding up the Wall Street Journal. Their stock had hit another record high, and competitors were scrambling to implement their own versions of the Martinez method. "The board wants to make you Chief Innovation Officer in addition to operations." Frank smiled, remembering his father's words about titles. What would that mean, exactly? "It means," Sarah entered and closed the door, "that other companies want to learn from us. They want to understand how we've created a corporate structure that's both more transparent and more secure, more integrated and more efficient." She paused, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "They want to know how a former janitor revolutionized corporate America." "We," Frank corrected gently. "How we revolutionized it." Sarah sat in one of his visitor chairs, the comfortable ones he'd specifically chosen because he remembered how the old ones felt after long shifts. "The business schools are calling. They want case studies, lectures, books." She leaned forward. "Frank, what we've built here, it's bigger than Blackwood now. It's changing how people think about hierarchy, about potential, about leadership itself." Before Frank could respond, Janet buzzed through on the intercom. "Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. The television monitors in Frank's office flicked on to show Richard Chen giving a press conference. He looked older, diminished somehow, standing before the SEC building in Washington. And so, I am announcing my full cooperation with the federal investigation into corporate espionage and securities fraud. Richard's voice carried none of its old smooth confidence. Furthermore, I want to publicly apologize to Blackwood Enterprises, to Sarah Blackwood, and especially to Frank Martinez. Their innovative approach to corporate transparency not only exposed my actions, but has shown the entire business world a better way forward. Sarah muted the sound, turning to Frank with shining eyes. Vindication looks good on you, Frank thought. About the long journey from that night in the elevator to this moment. About how his father's lessons about dignity and hard work had shaped not just his life, but now the lives of thousands of others. About how seeing value in every person, every job, every contribution had transformed from a personal philosophy into a corporate movement. You know what this reminds me of? He said, moving to the windows. All those years cleaning these windows, I used to watch the sunrise and imagine what it would be like on this side of the glass. But I never imagined this. Sarah joined him. At the window. What did you imagine? Just doing good work, making things better, cleaner, more efficient. Taking care of people who didn't know they were being taken care of. He turned to her. I never expected to change anything big. I just wanted to do the small things right. But that's exactly why you've changed everything, Sarah said softly. You showed us that the small things are the big things, that every person, every job, every detail matters. She took his hand, a gesture that now felt as natural as breathing. You showed me that sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from someone who's seen every level, who understands both the foundation and the penthouses. The morning sun painted the city in shades of possibility, glinting off windows that Frank had once cleaned, now transformed into mirrors, reflecting a future neither of them had imagined. In that light, standing beside the woman who had seen his potential that night in the elevator, Frank felt the full weight of what they'd accomplished together. The board meeting starts in an hour, Sarah said, not letting go of his hand. They'll want to discuss expansion plans, speaking tours, consulting opportunities. She smiled. Ready to show corporate America that fairy tales can come true? Frank thought about his father's photo on his desk, about Elena's pride, about Tommy, and Carlos and all the others whose lives were changing because someone had finally seen their value. He thought about the maintenance teams across their properties, now viewed as essential partners rather than invisible workers. And he thought about Sarah, who had trusted her company's future to a janitor's vision and her heart to his simple wisdom. You know what my father always said about fairy tales? Frank replied, squeezing her hand. The best ones aren't about magic at all. They're about seeing the truth that was there all along. Together they watched the city awaken, their shared legacy rising with the sun, a testament to what happens when dignity meets opportunity, when wisdom knows no hierarchy, and when love grows in the space between windows and walls. 1 year to the day after the elevator incident, Frank found himself back in his old basement locker room. The space had been renovated as part of the company-wide improvements, but his old locker still stood in its familiar corner. Inside, his perfectly pressed grey uniform hung like a memory, kept as a reminder of where his journey had begun. I thought I'd find you here, Elena's voice echoed in the now empty room. Didn't expect to see you in a 3-piece suit in the basement, though. She smiled, holding up a small paper bag. Brought you something. Inside was their father's old thermos, the one he'd carried to work every day for 30 years. The dents and scratches told the story of countless pre-dawn shifts of dignity maintained through decades of service. Found it when I was cleaning out the storage unit, Eleanor explained. Thought you might want it for your office. You know, to keep you humble now that you're famous and all. Frank ran his fingers over the worn surface, remembering mornings watching his father prepare for work, filling this thermos with coffee that would fuel his unwavering dedication to doing things right. Have you seen the training center? he asked his sister. She shook her head, and he led her to what had once been a storage area for cleaning supplies. The space had been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility where maintenance staff now received technical and business training. Through the glass walls, they could see a class in session, window washers learning about building systems engineering, supervised by Carlos, who had flown in from Los Angeles for the program launch. Every maintenance worker in the company gets a chance at advancement now, Frank explained. But not just up, they can move in any direction they want to grow. We've had accountants training in building systems, executives learning maintenance protocols, breaking down walls, Eleanor suggested, echoing the phrase that had become his trademark in business magazines. Building bridges, he corrected, watching a young woman in a maintenance uniform confidently explaining pressure systems to a group of suits from the financial department. They took the executive elevator to Frank's office, the same one he'd pried open that fateful night. The car no longer had any dead spots in cell service, and a plaque commemorated the incident that had sparked the company's transformation. His office had evolved too. Alongside the degrees and business awards hung photographs of maintenance teams from every Blackwood property. His father's picture held the place of honor on his desk, now joined by the old thermos, symbols of heritage proudly displayed in a space that embodied progress. Sarah was waiting for them, casual in the way she only was with people she trusted completely. Elena, perfect timing. I need your help convincing your brother to accept the Forbes cover story. Elena laughed. Good luck. He still won't let me frame the Wall Street Journal article in his apartment, which is exactly why we need it, Sarah insisted, perching on the edge of Frank's desk with comfortable familiarity. The story isn't just about Frank anymore. It's about showing everyone that success doesn't have to mean forgetting where you came from. Frank looked out at the city, his city in so many ways. He cleaned these windows, maintained these buildings, and now he was helping shape their future. More importantly, he was helping shape the futures of countless others who, like him, just needed someone to see their potential. Speaking of not forgetting, Elena said with a sly smile, Mama's expecting you both for Sunday dinner, and Sarah, she wants your opinion on wedding venues. Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. They hadn't announced their engagement yet. The ring was still hidden in Frank's desk drawer, waiting for the perfect moment. But families had a way of knowing things before they were said. Your mother's getting ahead of things, Sarah said diplomatically, but her eyes met Frank's with warm promise. Mama's never wrong about these things, Eleanor winked. Remember what she said the first time Sarah came to dinner? That woman looks at you the way I used to look at your father, like you hung the moon and kept it clean too. After Elena left, Frank and Sarah stood by the windows, watching the maintenance team across the street. Their movements were as precise as ever, but now they wore safety equipment that exceeded industry standards, one of Frank's first company-wide mandates. You know what I love most about our story? Sarah said softly. It's not about a janitor becoming an executive. It's about someone brave enough to bring his true self, everything he learned from the ground up, into the executive suite. Frank thought about the thermos on his desk, about his father's lessons in dignity, about the maintenance teams now taking business classes at night, just as he had. Maybe that's why it worked, he said. Because we didn't try to transform people into something else. We just helped them become more of who they already were. Sarah leaned against him, professional boundaries long since transformed into deeper trust. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Ready to show them the global expansion plans? Frank straightened his tie, an unconscious gesture he'd never quite lost, and picked up his tablet. The maintenance revolution that had started in one building was about to go worldwide. But as he held the door for Sarah, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, suited, confident, respected, yet still the same man who had once made these windows shine in the dawn light. Some transformations, he realized, weren't about becoming different, but about becoming more fully yourself. And sometimes the greatest dignity lay not in rising above your past, but in lifting it with you as you climbed. 5 years to the day after a trapped elevator changed everything, Frank Martinez stood in the lobby of the newly renamed Martinez Blackwood Tower. The building's transformation mirrored his own. Same strong foundations, but reimagined, renewed, reaching higher than anyone had thought possible. The morning sun streamed through windows that were now maintained by a team of certified building systems engineers, though Frank still occasionally caught himself checking for streaks. Old habits died hard, and some habits were worth keeping. Ready for the big announcement? Sarah appeared beside him, as elegant and commanding as ever, but with a softness in her eyes reserved just for him. Their wedding ring matched the simple gold band his father had worn, a choice that had raised eyebrows in society columns but felt right to them both. The lobby was filling with reporters, employees, and guests for the announcement of the Martinez Blackwood Foundation, their initiative to provide education, training, and advancement opportunities for maintenance and service workers worldwide. But first, they had a private ceremony to attend. In the basement locker room, now a state-of-the-art training facility, a small group had gathered. Elena was there with her family. Janet stood beside Carlos, who'd flown in from running the West Coast Division. And Tommy, now operations director for the Asian Pacific region, waited with a covered frame in his hands. "Pop would be proud," Elena whispered, squeezing Frank's hand as Tommy unveiled the photograph, their father in his maintenance uniform, now permanently honored in the building where his son had started as a janitor and risen to become co-owner. The plaque beneath it read, "Francisco Martinez Sr., dignity isn't in what you do, but in how you do it." His wisdom built more than he knew. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of both CEO and family member. "This building stands because of people like Francisco Martinez, people who understand that maintaining something properly is as important as building it in the first place. Today, we honor that truth by ensuring others have the same opportunity to rise that his son did." Frank thought about the journey that had brought him here, about that night in the elevator when he'd chosen to act rather than wait for protocol, about Sarah seeing potential where others saw only a janitor, about Richard Chen's attempted takeover, inadvertently sparking a revolution in corporate culture. "The foundation will provide full scholarships," he announced to the gathered group. "But not just for traditional education. We'll fund technical training, business courses, and a new type of integrated program that breaks down the artificial barriers between maintenance and management, just like you did," Tommy added. Pride evident in his voice, "like we all did," Frank corrected. "Every person who embraced change, who saw possibility instead of limitations, who helped prove that understanding a building from the ground up makes you better at running it from the top down." Later, in their shared office on the top floor, a space deliberately designed to be accessible to all employees, Sarah handed Frank the latest company report. The Martinez method had been adopted by corporations worldwide, transforming not just businesses, but lives. "Look at this," she smiled, pointing to a photograph. A maintenance worker in Singapore was teaching corporate strategy to executives. In London, a former housekeeper had become head of sustainability initiatives. The revolution they'd started had taken on a life of its own. "Your father was right," Sarah said softly, moving to stand beside him at the windows. Their favorite spot for quiet moments together. "Dignity isn't in what you do, but what you did, Frank. You gave dignity a new meaning. You showed that respect and opportunity shouldn't depend on titles or traditions." Frank wrapped an arm around her waist, remembering all the sunrises he'd watched through these windows, all the dreams he'd had while keeping them clean. "We showed that," he corrected gently. "You had to see it first, that night in the elevator." "I saw someone who cared enough to break protocol to help others," she smiled. "You showed me everything else, how understanding every level of a business makes you better at running it, how breaking down walls between people builds stronger companies, how love can grow in the most unexpected places." The morning light caught Sarah's wedding ring as she reached up to straighten his tie, their private ritual. Below them the city was waking up, and in buildings across Manhattan, maintenance teams were starting their day with new pride, new opportunities, new respect. "Ready to change a few more lives?" Sarah asked, gathering her notes for the foundation announcement. Frank picked up his father's thermos, now a lucky charm he carried to every major event. In its scratched surface, he saw reflected all the lessons that had brought him here. Dignity in service, value in every task, strength in breaking down barriers, and love in seeing the true worth in others. "Always ready," he smiled, holding the door for his wife, partner, and fellow revolutionary. Together they headed down to the lobby where their next chapter waited to begin. Not a fairy tale anymore, but a living testament to what happens when someone looks past appearances to see the potential waiting to shine through.